And it's also going to make things a whole lot more fun. We all know the difference a good story makes to a good game. Tokens and monetary incentives should be secondary to the game itself. A good game will be able to stand on its own. A good token, not necessarily.
Maybe it's actually easier to look at this a little deeper from the opposite side of like, what is bad token design? I know we talked about general pitfalls, but what are some themes that you've generally seen in bad token design that you have personally learned from, or Shrapnel has learned from, Francis?
I think part of it is trying to do too much at once, right? Especially in gaming, right? You look at what a token is for. It's meant to make you absorbed in an ecosystem. Same thing works at a poker table. The reason they give you chips is so that you don't think it's real money. When you go from one country to the other, you can think of that as like a gaming currency. Like you have to switch because it is a sub-economy within the world. Just like when you're coming into Shrapnel, like the currency that you have is meant to be a fictional piece. Like it is meant to be slightly fictionalized in how you think about it, how you use it, and what you can do with it. And I think that's a story that a lot of people forget to tell. When we're doing a lot of this, we notice people were designing tokens around like almost purely financial models, and then also replacing typical game usages with just token, and we're going, that's token design. Like they would put some staking in, they would put some basic in-app purchases in and go, that's done. But like really what you're meant to ask yourself is like, what am I trying to get my user to do here? Like, what is the behavioral action that I'm trying to push them towards? Because that's what game design is really. You're trying to make people perform actions and then enjoy it. And I think that's how we approached our token design, because we noticed a lot of this over-financialization of gaming where the only motivation was profit, or just going back to a default like, hey, this is a typical video game usage. Whereas we turned it around and was like, maybe if we sat there and tried to think of, okay, there's a giant list of new potential motivations that a person can have as a player with a token that has value. How do we connect that to traditional game design thought processes and design something around making them do things with that token?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. We talk a lot about how for a lot of teams, it seems like the idea of like, okay, we need a token comes first, and then kind of shoehorning it into the game after that, mixed with we've, for better or for worse, built a fundraising model in Web3 gaming where VCs, at least in this era, expect there to be a token. So that was increasing pressure on teams to shoehorn a token in, even if it's not even in the original spec. Felix, I'd love to get your thoughts on the same topic, and maybe also, because you focus in this area, the emerging compliance issues we've discovered in using tokens in game design and what teams need to think about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love what Francis said. One thing that it reminded me a lot of is the typical things you learn about modeling and everything in uni when you do engineering, is that you kind of want to build up a model that makes sense for the actual domain that you're trying to facilitate as well. So, for example, the DeFi terms of staking and liquidity provision and so on, it doesn't necessarily make sense in a game. So if you can build up that lore and the understanding of what inner work is you're trying to achieve inside of the game itself, that's going to make way more sense for the people. And it's also going to make things a whole lot more fun, because lore is always important for those who are interested. I mean, we all know the difference a good story makes to a good game. If you have outstanding mechanics, but the story is boring, a lot of people will drop off because they don't find something that hooks them in. It's just as relevant to think about that when you're actually working with something that could have monetary value. And I think the other key thing is, and I'm not sure, I know that Francis agrees with me on that one, that is that tokens and monetary incentives should be secondary to the game itself. A good game will be able to stand on its own. A good token, not necessarily. It's going to be way harder because it's just a token. It's supposed to be used to transact for something. So you want to have that value in there, right? And that can be a perfect segue into talking about more token compliance and so on as well. And that's where Francis is kind of one of my guiding hands at times as well. It's very important to have good utilities, tying back to what we talked about when it comes to how we test and securities and so on. It's very important to make sure that the token isn't necessarily strictly tied to your type of organization, depending on where things are navigating. There are a lot of rabbit holes we can delve into there. I think that's a separate conversation to talk about. I think that the most important thing is making sure that when you build a game with a token, to make it as clear as possible that the token is intended to be used for value outside of actual making money, and building up good avenues where people can transact and exchange value that isn't necessarily strictly monetarily driven. The other side is making sure that you don't frame it as, for example, if you are to fundraise, that you're looking to strictly make money off of it, because then again, there's the Howey test. And there are a lot of different other areas as well. I think, Francis, you'd probably want to chime in here.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing I think a lot of people forget is the gaming industry with a capital G, otherwise known as gambling, also exists. And that happens anytime, we get into the space. If you play a game or you do thing, you make money at someone else's expense, right? Like you bet on some kind of circumstance to happen, and that does happen, and you make money. Or it doesn't happen and you lose money. So I think it is very easy on the game design front for people, especially in the Web3 space, to accidentally crawl into the capital G gaming space and open a whole bunch of different doors that they don't want to open that get them into a ton of different types of regulatory problems. So I think that is one of the key problems that people end up walking into and don't understand, I think, deeply enough, because you don't just have one country potentially coming after you. You have every single country you've sold a copy of this game in coming after you. The other piece is understanding the separation and structure between the token, the actual company making the token, all of these things. People always recommend different types of things. I think the core thing there that differentiates them is the DAO is not the company that makes the game. The DAO is the thing that should be directing the company that makes the game to perform certain types of actions. And having a good legal structure there is always good. The final piece coming into kind of what Felix was saying is the token design has to have enough utility to be not just an argument for someone making profit. There has to be some good use cases there that differentiate themselves. And I think, coming back to the whole idea of, hey, I just stake money and things happen. Well, there's tons of things that can happen, but people seem to be focused solely on just giving you tokens back. It's maybe, as a gamer, I'd be happy to deposit, let's say, $100 onto a platform, never touch that $100, but just get continuous rewards. It's like buying, an infinite season pass, or it's like getting a battle pass over again, or access to certain skins, or exclusive access to content. There's so many different things you can do with staking, rebranded as other formats. That's where a lot of these folks could get themselves into less legal hurdles if they just made a slightly more complex system that's actually geared towards gaming and not just investing.
Yeah.
The staking piece is really interesting because it really talks about how you can use cryptocurrency in a way that's actually unique to the space. You're doing something that you're not capable of doing in other games, and that's what makes a Web3 game actually exciting.
The interesting piece there, right, is you've motivated someone to put money into the game. Someone has decided to put, let's say it's $100, put $100 into the game. If they're interested enough and you've done a good enough job, they're probably going to want to spend that after staking it. They're probably going to look at a piece of content and go, yes, let me do that. Yes, let me do that. So initially, there was a carrot of, oh, you don't actually have to spend the money. You just have to deposit it and it's all good. And then the stick is oh, look at all this dope stuff that we have done in our ecosystem. So from a game design perspective, you've done the hardest thing to do, which is get people to put money onto the platform to buy the content you're making, because there was no push to be hey, just deposit this and then we keep it forever. No, it's the push of deposit this, you can withdraw it whenever you want. And I think that's one of the nuances that, at least at Shrapnel, we've thought about so much when it comes to what you can do in the space.
Right. And there's a much lighter barrier of entry if you know that it's money you just pull back out at any time.
Yeah. It kind of also shows another natural progression to what pure staking would be, because now you have the time aspect that Francis just mentioned as well, where you stake for a while, or then after a while, let's say it's a time-based one, instead of just taking the money out and just disappearing and that whole cycle ends, you can then see, okay, I've had a trial period now, I've made some money, and now I can actually spend all of that if I want to as well. That goes into building more of an intricate loop and more perpetuity into the ecosystem loop as well, which there are a lot of avenues you can play around with those aspects.
It's a psychological investment, and then it's basically, oh, this is house money, right? This is earned money. Why not just spend it in the ecosystem that's already invested in? It's very clever.
Yep.